Okay, so the title of my presentation is Play Therapies and Dementia, a Virtue Epistemic Investigation. An overview of this project. So I will be arguing that play therapies are a valuable approach to support the agency of people living with dementia across all the stages of severity. However, I want to claim that a virtue epistemic challenge arises with regard to play therapies of make-believe in particular, and the sort of thematizing questions that we could pose in relation to this virtue epistemic challenge is, first of all, how do we know if someone with dementia enters the world of make-believe or the world of as-if play knowingly and willingly? And does it matter if they don't enter that world knowingly and willingly, but participate nonetheless? And in response to this challenge, I am going to suggest framing playful agency in terms of a cosmological conception of play inspired by phenomenologist Eugen Fink. Aha, yes, you didn't know Fink was going to appear in this talk because I didn't mention Fink at all, leaving it as a surprise. And that's in fact where we head towards the end of the talk. So any Fink specialists in the audience, I can't wait to hear about your contributions. The sequence of discussion, we will talk about the types of play therapy. We'll talk a little bit about play therapy in relation to dementia. We'll pause for a minute, as it were, to give a definition of virtue epistemology in case any folks in the audience are new to that particular domain. And we'll look at the question of epistemic vices in relation to dementia care. And actually at that particular point, I will share essentially a 5-minute summary or less of the paper that Erik referenced, so Epistemic Arrogance, Moral Harm and Dementia, because that will provide us a little bit of a springboard into the rest of the conversation. We'll turn to the virtue epistemic challenge that I just outlined in a little bit more detail. Then we'll turn to talking about play, make-believe, and deception, because in fact, deception might be the epistemic vice or moral vice that is the most interesting to examine in this context. And then finally, we'll turn to consideration of playful agency cosmologically conceived. And when I use the word cosmological here, I'm actually borrowing it from an article that Jan Halak wrote and describing Fink's philosophy of play essentially as a kind of cosmological consideration of play within the constitution of world. Okay, so types of play therapy, and you have some images accompanying this that I'll refer to as we go. There are very commonly now many types of sensory stimulation activities that could fall under this umbrella of play therapy. In the bottom right of this slide, you see a person wearing a kind of fidget blanket. They're called in English. I'm not sure in your, if your first language is not English, I'm not sure what you call it. I'm curious to know. Fidgeting in English means kind of nervous physical activity. It's when you can't settle down. So the fidget blanket, and in this case, it's an apron, actually, a fidget apron, as you can see, is full of little things that you can touch and that you can engage with. They're often things like zippers and buttons that you can sort of zip and unzip. Little objects you can maybe take out of bags and put back in. And that's a fairly common tool that's now used, or I almost said toy, but it's interesting. I'm not sure if we call it a toy, but it's certainly something that's meant to provide some interest to someone living with later stage dementia. And I think it's a lovely sort of thing because you can actually create your own for someone that you love. And that's kind of a very creative thing for the maker as well. We also can talk about play therapy in terms of creative expression, such as making crafts, doing music, participating in other sorts of arts. We can talk about play therapy in terms of physical activity. So mirroring somebody as a game, for example, physically mirroring gestures for fun, doing adapted sports games or dancing. These are examples of types of play therapy that have a very motor or physical component. Simple games and puzzles. So for example, spatial reasoning games, adapted word games that are focused a little bit more on the cognitive are also considered forms of play therapy. And then reminiscence and storytelling activities. And the photo in the top right of this slide shows two older adults looking at a photo album together. So that is an example of what could be called reminiscence activity, assuming that they are looking at some photos, older photos together, and maybe sharing stories about the photos and the memories those evoke. And then finally, humor shouldn't be left off this list, in my opinion. And based on some of the research I've been doing in very practical approaches to dementia care for professionals out there, humor gets mentioned more and more as a very, very important tool to engage with people living with dementia. So something like improv theater is an example that could, and definitely I think easily does, involve a lot of laughing and joking around. And I think that's an example that is worth maybe coming back to later as well, thinking about improv scenarios. And it looks like the photos on this slide, we might say the top right. I don't believe that nose is actually that young woman's real nose. I think she's wearing a clown nose. I hope you all agree. Who knows what the elderly lady is thinking in that moment? Her expression is difficult to read, but it does look like she's clapping or doing something engaging with her hands in the direction of the person playing the small, I guess that's a ukulele or something. And this person, by the way, is in the role of a clown elder, an elder clown, somebody who is engaging specifically with older adults in a kind of clown persona. So that could be an example of humor engagement. And the bottom right slide is actually an example of some improv. All of the folks in this lower photo were asked to perform the emotion of doubt. And so the gentleman in the front is showing us, a kind of interpretation of that feeling of being in doubt. So there are many different types of play therapy, and I think it's fascinating to think about what other kinds of activities we could include in this broad category. But broadly speaking, they are used to help people communicate and overcome challenges of a social, emotional, or cognitive variety, for example. And play therapy has been used with children for a long time, and I think that the transition to thinking about it much more seriously in relation to people living with dementia is maybe a natural result of the work that's been done with young humans. But I think it also has a lot of unique dimensions, of course. And there is research now that proves certain benefits for people with dementia in relation to engaging in play therapies. And these benefits include, for example, the promotion of social interaction and creative expression, the reduction of apathy and stress, the boosting of self-esteem, the fostering of a sense of belonging and community, and the improvement of cognitive and motor performance. So these are all amazing benefits that makes you think immediately we should be really, really investing in this kind of toolkit that play therapy seems to be promising. So that's the first element, talking through play therapy a little bit to give an overview, make sure that we are sort of coming at this conversation from a similar space. This moment also we should take to get on the same page about virtue epistemology. This is an extremely simplified or watered down kind of composition to get a grip on what's at work in virtue epistemology. It's essentially a contemporary approach to thinking through virtues and vices that are particular to intellectual work, to the formation of beliefs, to the deployment of knowledge. And we have obviously connections to Aristotle and other historical philosophers working on things like the intellectual virtues and vices. But virtue epistemology is asking a lot of questions about really I think the context of production of belief in relation to certain types of vice or virtue, and thinking through how we might mitigate effects of, for example, intellectual vices like epistemic arrogance, which is basically an attitude towards a situation or another person where the knower is assuming that they have an adequate sense of the situation or the interests of the person they're engaging with, so that they go ahead and form judgments without further engaging, without further inquiring into details they might be missing, or perspectives of that other person, for instance, that might be really important to incorporate. So it is kind of like the sort of general notion of arrogance that we have in contrast to humility, for example. But when applied to the epistemic realm, it takes on a kind of dimension purely in relation to the knowledge and the beliefs that we're developing and that we then act on. Other examples of vice that gets mentioned quite a lot would be a kind of carelessness towards how one is forming one's beliefs versus the virtue of attentiveness or even open-mindedness, or the vice of deceptiveness or even dishonesty in relation to accuracy or honesty. Those are just three examples that I pulled out of kind of virtue vice pairings, because I think I ended up, when I'm thinking through this project, I ended up thinking about those three in particular quite a bit. I'm sure there are others that could be highlighted, but for the sake of focusing a little bit on a few, these are the ones you'll hear me talk a little bit more about. Now, I myself am fairly new to virtue epistemology as an approach to thinking through the moral justice, the morality of belief, as it were, and how we form them and act on them. So I really dived into it for the first time in generating a position paper in relation to epistemic arrogance. So that was published in the Journal of Philosophy of Disability a few years ago. And in that paper, I focused on epistemic arrogance in particular in relation to questions of causing moral harm to people living with dementia. What I'd like to do for all of you here this morning is to offer a little summary, but actually what I'm doing here is broadening it out, the argument out, to include other types of epistemic vices as well. So it's sort of a generalized argument coming out of that paper that I don't make there, but I think it's a good thing to have in place today, because we're going to be going in certain directions where you might wonder, where I'm coming from. And this will help you understand a bit of a grounding for me in relation to thinking about people living with dementia in relation to epistemic vices. So I've set this up a little bit like in terms of an argument structure with some premises. So the first assumption would be that people living with moderate to severe dementias, and I'm going to abbreviate that as PWD for the rest of the talk, These folks are often in the care of those with professional or familial duty to tend to their well-being. And I take it that that's a pretty statistically verifiable fact. The second assumption is that, a person's well-being in part depends on their interests, preferences, and plans being supported. I don't know how much of a person's well-being depends on this, but a certain amount surely does. In fact, and so in other words, if my interests, preferences, and plans are being wholly discounted in the development of actions that will affect me, I think it's fair to say that my well-being will decrease in some percentage. Then we move to talking about epistemic vices. So the third premise I develop is this idea that epistemic vices such as arrogance or carelessness or deception can lead to non-PWDs, so people living without dementia, wrongly ignoring, discounting, or being otherwise deaf to PWD's interests and preferences. So this is really an important place to pause because it's something that you can pull in a lot of current literature on. So all of the literature that talks about, for example, the tragedy discourse surrounding dementia is ultimately, I think, a clear set of evidence at how easy it is for people without dementia to be arrogant, to epistemically arrogant, careless in relation to people living with dementia. So in other words, assuming that those of us who do not have dementia, that we can guess what it's like to have dementia, and on the basis of that decide, for instance, that it's like quote unquote a living death, which is one of the phrases one can come across looking at the tragedy discourse that surrounds dementia. That's a living death, that it's like neither living nor non-living, that it's an undignified existence and so forth. And the more we learn about people the more we hear from people living with dementia in sort of scientifically rigorous contexts where we're getting first-person reporting that's being reliably replicated, the more we hear, the more we can realize, those of us without dementia, that we could be quite off base with some of those assumptions, that the quality of life is actually so horrible. For instance, it might not be. Now, the fourth and final premise that I will present here is connecting to just again the fact that progressive dementia in the moderate severe stages pretty much invariably will come with a certain amount of impairment in relation to a person's ability to express themselves verbally, to have memory working for them so that they can remember important details when it's needed, for example, in an argument, in order to justify something that they'd like, that memory might not be there to support them. Or communication may just be down on all fronts. So because of those complications that typically do come with later stages of dementia, I would argue that epistemic vices like epistemic arrogance are going to be more likely to arise in the minds of people who are caring for folks with dementia. It just seems more likely to arise because you are on a day-to-day basis trying to understand someone who has difficulty expressing potentially what they're thinking and why, and what they're feeling and why. And as we know with dementia, there can be cycles of better days and worse days, better hours, worse hours, better minutes, worse minutes. And it just seems in that kind of a context that someone may jump to conclusions quickly and make decisions on behalf of someone without fully taking into account what they might want themselves, if they're still capable of some kind of preference building and preference expression. So the argument that ultimately I make in this paper concludes with the kind of normative lesson that if we would like to get better, we being people living without dementia, or perhaps people living with less severe dementia, if we want to get better at not performing epistemic vices, intentionally or unintentionally, we should become more aware of that conversation concerning what some of those vices and temptations epistemic temptations might be, so that we can figure out ways to lessen their impact. Possibly, for instance, by emphasizing their correlate virtues. So if we're concerned about falling into an epistemic arrogance, then what we need to do is think about what it means to be humble, right? Epistemically humble when we're interacting with someone with dementia. So almost assuming that we don't know what they feel and what they know, and finding ways to figure that out together. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, a virtue epistemic challenge seems to arise when we think specifically about play therapies or playing that involve make-believe. Now, on the one hand, of course, make-believe seems to offer everyone this freeing sense of agency and fun. So on the face of it, we'd say, yeah, the more make-believe and as if play we can incorporate into dementia care contexts, the better. But the pause is generated, I think, by the sort of follow-up thought. Well, but what if the person I'm interacting with isn't aware that we're entering this place of make-believe, and they think that what's happening is quote unquote real, or is connecting to something that is going to have real world consequences. So what if that line is not being policed by that person living with dementia, and we engage them in play? Does it matter? Is kind of the other question worth raising in response to this potential hiccup. Thinking about make-believe and dementia care. Does it matter if someone with dementia is confusing the play, the as if, the hypothetical, the make-believe with the real? So to start building this dimension of the project a little bit, I actually would like to turn to an article by Agnieszka Jaworska. It's called Respect for Autonomy in the Face of Dementia, the Case of Deception. And yes, it appeared as a chapter in the edited book that Velko and I did together. And it really, really caught my imagination, my attention, because Jaworska, who is of course well known in dementia literature for arguing for the importance of respecting marginal agencies and respecting people living with dementia because they still have the capacity to care. So care being a really important value that Jaworska promotes as a reason to continue to always seek out the engagement and the consent of people living with dementia. Here, she actually is taking on a very specific question about deceptive practices in relation to people living with dementia. And she gives many examples because by now we've all heard of many examples of ways that long-term care facilities, for example, or at-home caregivers will kind of create an artifice for their loved one or for their client or for their resident to engage in. So Jaworska wants to ask, because she's very concerned about respect and autonomy, she wants to ask, is it morally okay to do this? She ends up saying yes. So she says at times it might be okay to engage in these sorts of deceptive practices in view of a larger duty, a more important duty to support that frail autonomy of the person. So an example that she uses that I like is you have someone who in their life prior to dementia was a very successful chef. And cooking is extremely important to them. And they're giving evidence that they still seek out the kitchen, that they still want to be engaged in cooking food for other people. However, their dementia is so far progressed that doing that would be dangerous, maybe even for the people eating the food, but certainly for the person who would be engaging with the various appliances in the kitchen and so forth. So Jaworska says you could use staged elements of a live kitchen in an activity to support that person's desire to continue cooking, even though it's not actually them that are doing the cooking. So you'd kind of play act that they're the chef, and they seem to engage in that role. I'm the chef, but all of the other people in that kitchen are actually ahead of time Confederates, and they'll be the ones to prepare the meal, and potentially they will give credit to that meal to the chef, even though they didn't actually necessarily do a lot of the cooking, though perhaps, and hopefully they engaged in some activities like chopping some vegetables, for example. So Jaworska says that seems okay. But she also says that artifice is only needed if that person lacks understanding of their waning abilities. So if they understand that they can no longer cook, you really shouldn't be setting up a situation where you're like, hello, chef, welcome, because they will look at you and say, I don't know how to cook. This is insulting. I don't know how to cook properly anymore. I'm nervous and anxious because you think I can. So that's not a good occasion to do it. Jaworska also then, and this is where it becomes interesting, I think, for thinking about make-believe generally and dementia care. Jaworska also claims that make-believe experience is, if it's totally fake, it's disrespectful. And the example she gives is of a simulated presence audio tape. So that's a tape, a voice recording that's made by someone that is maybe a family member or a loved one of the person with dementia. And the tape is sort of like a quasi conversation. So the person recording is going to say something like, hello, Joyce. Good morning. How are you? Pause. Right? And then Joyce, the person living with dementia, might respond, thinking that they're having a conversation. They'll start engaging with the voice. And the conversation kind of goes on, even though it's a pre-recorded script and then a live person engaging. Jaworska thinks that's absolutely not okay to do something like that. And that example alone of that audio tape and some others that I've heard of over the years in relation to complete fake, right, made me really wonder, is it really always terrible? Is it really always just obviously morally wrong to do something like that? And it brought me to this place of wondering about the virtue, the epistemic vice of dishonesty and deception. Are you engaging in that moment in something that's actually epistemically morally wrong because you're being dishonest or deceptive, and you're sort of feeding this to someone and they run with it? So now we're transitioning actually already to a little bit the last moments of the presentation, where we really turn to play and thinking a little bit more about deception in relation to play, and then turning towards Fink. So while I support Jaworska's argument that it is at times morally acceptable to deceive someone, so intentionally deceiving someone living with dementia, given the reasons that she provides, I also hesitate to say that cases of quote unquote complete sham or fake ought to be automatically considered as morally wrong. So I think the case of make-believe, and in particular make-believe in relation to play therapy, should be examined more carefully. and one of the ways that we can work through that that investigation is by starting with a kind of realization of the ambiguity of make-believe in itself. And so make-believe is not purely truthful, of course. Nobody would say that. But it also doesn't seem completely deceptive if certain conditions are met. If make-believe is happening, it seems like the real and the meaningful are being blurred. And that's kind of what make-believe is about. It's not very good make-believe if that's not happening. There needs to be some sense in which the make-believe is actually constructing meaning for whoever's engaging in it seriously. And the serious part is this connection to this idea of realness. It is real play. And I think because of that ambiguity in make-believe, we can say that it becomes interesting and maybe even very suitable for handling some of the challenging aspects of agency support for people with cognitive decline, with dementia. And that's where we're going to spend a little more time now, thinking about, first of all, the blurring of that, the real with the meaningful, and also thinking about people with dementia and how to support agency within the context of make-believe. First of all, I just have to say I love this photograph. I'm sorry I didn't capture the image credit. I don't know, I lost that, but I just love this moment of card playing because I feel like he's about to just lay down the trump card and he is just so in it. He's so in it. And he's probably looking at the buddy that he's gonna screw over maybe a little bit in this moment. And he's milking it. He's gonna make the most of this moment where he's gonna play this card that's gonna win the trick. And I think it captures a lot of what's beautiful and meaningful about play. So they do say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In a way, what we'll do now is sort of think about what's happening in this scene and make some generalizations about the moment of make-believe. So philosophies of make-believe and play typically do focus in initially on the nature of the contrast between serious activity, real activity, and playful activity. So for example, Plato speaks about playful acts as, or mimetic acts as shallow imitations of the real, and he disparages them because of that. Or for thinking about the value of play to real life is often a move that comes out of that initial question, right? How does play relate to the real world? Well, what's the value of play in relation to the real world? And we have various well-known authors, well-known philosophers of play kind of answering that. And that seems to be one of the big contributions that they want to make is, for example, Huizinga says, look, the value of play is to teach us to learn about rules and to respect rules, for instance, is one facet, at least, of his account. And then Kaloa says, well, we're training our minds, we're having this emotional catharsis through play, and that's very important for real life. It's a place to recharge and reset and then head back into the horrible stress of I don't know, the modern world. So that's one place to begin, yes. But what really has inspired me learning a little bit, looking a little bit and learning a little bit about Eugen Fink's conception is that it's the phenomenological starting point of, instead of just assuming that the categories of real world and play are meaningful in this metaphysical sense, why don't we just take a step back and think about the underlying and founding category of meaning, meaningful experience. So what if we start instead by looking for a tie to the creation of meaningful experience, and that is where spheres of activity, maybe we call it playful, maybe we call it make-believe, maybe we call it activity in something constructed as the real world, but what is it that they all have in common in relation to the creation of meaning? And so play for Fink ends up acting as a kind of symbol of the world. And it's symbolic in the sense that it is bringing forth the appearance of the inherently and essentially relational and constructive character of human experience. So it's almost like it in its very structure, play is the purest way to get at what is fundamentally at work in all experience, which is construction of meaning, and through relationality. So the world is a condition upon which living and unliving entities intertwine in an open project of relationship. So the talk of the real world and reality in a lot of conversations about play is something that we can try to set aside here and think a little bit more about world as a space of unfolding possibilities, where maybe you have a rule to start with, but there's no reason to think that rule is essential to the unfolding of meaning that's occurring. And there's a connection to ethics. So in play, we are going to invariably be active participants, and we're going to have interests and abilities and vulnerabilities and preferences, and those things will carve out where we stand and how we respond to that world's openness. We don't need to be aware of the world as open, but we simply are engaged in this way in the world as world. Whoop, that was my alarm. Okay. So I grabbed some quotes here to get at this idea of playful agency, cosmologically conceived, and hopefully they'll help, I don't know, add a little bit more flesh to this conception for you. So from Halleck's really nice article, I pulled this conception of the common view of play. In that view, play is, quote, automatically endowed with an index of inferiority in regard to life as it is supposed to be in itself. Life is simply not mere play, and if we play, we are somehow distant or even absent from life itself, or from what life itself is about. And from Fink, by contrast, the other conception is that, quote, in the creativity of pure play, a person experiences himself as the playmate in the play of the world. Playing, he dwells in the play of the building and destroying, the joining and the separating, the letting be and annihilating of the world. So that's getting at this essential openness to play within world building, or play as world building in a very kind of transparent way, we could say. And then Catherine Homan also has written about Fink and play quite a bit, and I love the way she puts this. She says, quote, humans are not pawns in the play of the world, but playmates. By understanding world beings as co-players, we are reminded that others are not the result of our projections. Rather, we must let others be while remaining open to them. And I think this is a nice connection to, again, an epistemic vice like epistemic arrogance. An epistemically arrogant attitude would be one where we say, or we think rather, as a kind of presumption that others are, in fact, the result of our projections, that we assume we know what they think and feel and want, deserve, and we operate on the basis of that epistemically arrogant attitude. But this reframing allows us to kind of be a little bit more humble and understand that it's not about framing experience for someone else. They will be framing their own experience. And if we set them up with something, they will take that as they need and as they can. So going back to the dementia care context, in that freeing space of play, I almost want to say, I mean, I am saying it here, but it might be a little bit too stated too strongly. But I'm going to say, you know, neurotypical cognitively impaired people are a little bit on equal footing here in this space of play, if we understood play in terms of the sort of Finkian opening of possibility and the co-construction, right? The co-player model of experience. So no one would have an inherent advantage or disadvantage in a particular scenario. So the rules within play and make-believe are made by the players themselves, jointly or just as part of this evolving procedure. If you think back to Jaworska's example of the simulated audio tape, I was thinking, well, okay, we have to somehow make this work for that extreme case of what seems to be like a fake, total fake. Well, that we don't know, we cannot define for the person who is listening to that audio tape what that experience is like and what it means. And to assume that just because it can be read as a kind of setup doesn't mean that that's bad, because we are in fact giving someone a tool, an object, an artifact that they can engage with and interact and make meaningful. And that engagement becomes meaningful through that interaction. And so on the one hand, yes, there is a worry about potentially going in it in order to intentionally deceive. But in my view, that's not the intention, right? The intention is not to intentionally deceive. The intention is to give something to someone living with dementia that they may find meaningful and engaging. And in that sense, I think even that example can support the rather fragile autonomy of someone living with dementia. And I think that is why the conception of playful agency that you could say is inspired by this kind of cosmological view, thinking about the play space of world, can lessen the force of that virtue epistemic challenge that I raised at the start. So I've been arguing that yes, play therapies are a valuable approach to support the agency of people living with dementia across all stages of severity. I did raise a virtue epistemic challenge that perhaps there's a kind of victimization of people with dementia when we start handing them these make-believe scenarios and we aren't clear on whether they know if it is make-believe or not. And possibly that's a further gateway to building and strengthening intellectual vices like epistemic arrogance, or this kind of approach to creating deceptive experiences for others. And in response to this challenge, I'm suggesting that we might just be able to get away with framing playful agency in a different way, and a non-typical way. We give it a lot more credibility as a form of experience that is very valuable in and of itself, not in relation to a category of the real even, but that in terms of relationship and in terms of meaning creation, this actually could be a reframing that allows us to continue to kind of almost honestly engage with play therapies that may involve some make-believe or fakeness, in the knowledge that there's something else going on. It's not as simple as we are providing a fake to somebody and then laughing behind their backs because they fell for it. That's not what this is about. And so ultimately, I think we can be less worried about this virtue epistemic challenge. That's what I have for you. I do have references for you all, and further ones. If you're interested, I recommend just heading to my article, which is available for free online, and you can see my full list of references building there. But I'll stop there for now, and I want to say thank you all. Comment on this picture that you're seeing. I featured it at the very start of the presentation. It is actually headshots of various residents living in a memory care facility who were performing Woodstock. So the game was, we're going to dress up like it's Woodstock, which is the 1969 folk rock festival at the height of US hippiedom in New York. And so costumes were provided, and clearly round tinted glasses were plentiful. And everyone's smiling as their picture is taken. But this was an interesting image to me because it's so decontextualized. We don't know what the actual engagement with this theme was. And I think it's a nice image to give us food for thought as we're thinking about kind of inviting people living with various sorts of cognitive impairments into the sphere of make-believe. Do we need to care that much whether they understand, in this example, what Woodstock is? Do they have to remember Woodstock? Do they have to have a sense of what rock and roll is to have fun with this, to make it something really meaningful and to provide the sorts of benefits that we want to see from interpersonal engagement and play? And do we have to be afraid about sort of being deceptive to someone if they aren't aware of what Woodstock is? Not as long as we have a conception of playful agency that allows us to sort of distinguish between having essential rules to a game versus co-creating the rules as we go in response to how we are engaging as co-players in a situation. Also, I just like looking at all these people in wigs and happy faces.